speakers and panelists are getting their microphones all set and turning them on, I want you all to be thinking about your questions, okay? So you'll have an opportunity to ask them questions. So, maybe a few minutes. Thank you. So maybe I'll start with you. Let me start with Isaac first. And you've heard today from Bisrat regarding all the efforts in New York City in particular regarding confronting the HIV epidemic. And maybe from your perspective, you can give us a sense of, what's working, what's not working, what is the community, what do they know about HIV, how about access to PrEP, for example, what is being done and what more needs to be done from your perspective. So.
Well, first thing I want to say is that this summer I have a friend that actually he got diagnosed with HIV, and when he told me, I was kind of confused because I kind of thought to myself, how does someone get HIV in 2018? Like, especially in New York City, especially with like everyone I know, everyone's on PrEP, everybody knows about how to prevent HIV, and he basically told me that he had a friend, and when he told her that he was on PrEP, she kind of did a little bit of internet research, and she found some stuff online. And the internet, there's good and there's bad, right? Like, there's a lot of good information, there's a lot of bad information as well. And I think that she probably got some bad information. She kind of convinced him that PrEP wasn't the right decision for him. And so he got for PrEP, and he was telling me all this stuff. And I think I say all that to say that one of the things we have to do is make sure we're getting the right information out to people. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of the times, people just don't know. They don't have the right information. They don't have all the information. It's important to everyone.
Thank you. And Bisrat, what does that make you think about when you hear about really what's happening in real life?
I think that we need to do better. I'm in the field, so it feels like there's so much messaging out there. We do a lot of social marketing, and at times it feels like is this overkill. But from what I'm hearing and from what I've heard from other folks out there, and there's still groups of people that do not have enough education about HIV. There's a lot of stigma. This is reminding me, one subpopulation that we haven't done a great job of reaching are women of color. We did a survey to assess knowledge and awareness about PrEP. And given that, nearly 90% of women diagnosed in New York are women of color, we focused on that population. And only 10%, less than 10% of those women knew about PrEP. And less than 1% were utilizing PrEP themselves. And we actually sampled women in high incidence areas, so that was really concerning. So we're now launching a PrEP campaign focused on, both cis and transgender women of color. So, yeah, continuous messaging is really critical.
Yes, go ahead. Yes, please answer.
Earlier you mentioned the you. I think that's a really good message that needs to be kind of like put up a little bit more, because like you said, it does reduce the stigma for people who are already HIV positive. But also, the underlying message to get tested is know your status, because it's an way you equals you. That makes sense.
Yes. Yeah.
A lot of people I know don't even ever heard that term before, so that's.
We're working on a marketing strategy around you equals you, and a lot of other jurisdictions we're beginning to see a lot of messaging. I think the Maryland Department of Health just released something. So Texas has released some posters and social media messaging.
Can you speak up? I think maybe people in the back can hear better. Yeah.
I was just saying, you equals you. I agree. It's a potent anti-stigma, protesting messaging campaign, and we are working to launch a campaign focused on you equals you. So you'll be seeing a lot of it around.
Great. And I think there's also, and I know Jessica, maybe you can comment on this, there's been also at the beginning of a conversation about you equals you globally as well. And I'm wondering, when you think of the challenges in the global arena of confronting the HIV epidemic versus the challenges here, the local versus, I don't want to call it local versus global. I think it's local and global. As you listen to Bisrat and you listen to Isaac and what they're saying, can you think of sort of what could be relevant to in the global arena, and maybe what's relevant in the global arena that, based on what you presented, that could inform our local response?
Well, I think, we looked at the data from Malawi about knowledge of HIV transmission and knowledge of prevention, and clearly it was very low, not quite as low as what you just described for the PrEP awareness, but I think there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of knowledge about HIV and knowledge of prevention. And, I'm sure it would require a multi-pronged approach where there would be, education in schools as well as public service announcements, and having, celebrities go on radio shows and talk shows and talk about things, and we would need, I think, a very coordinated approach in order to address that gap.
Questions from the audience? Yes. Yes, please. Let's start with you, way back.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Bisrat. I was wondering if you are concerned at all. You talked about the epidemic decreasing in New York City, and I was wondering if you were concerned that this may be in part due to the changing population of New York and poorer and more heavily affected populations moving out. And I know that as researchers and data collectors, we'd all be very interested in what you do to make sure that the data that you're collecting is actually representative of the implementation that you're making, and not so much the changing population.
Yeah, that's a great question. And sort of, I think my colleagues in the surveillance unit probably have thought a lot more about that question, but we do, of course, keep track of census data. Of course, those who are undocumented, that's hard to track. And we have seen some shifts in the burden of HIV among Latino Hispanic populations here in the U.S. and with the current policy. I wouldn't be surprised if there are some dynamics there that are affecting the numbers. So, currently all we have is the, census data. We use that as the denominator. So, but, that's a very valid concern. It's something we're, sort of keeping in mind. We are, Ryan White services are provided irrespective of, documentation, citizenship status, and so we do look at, any declines in Ryan White utilization. That's something, we're very watchful of. But the current policies, we have heard anecdotally that people are less likely to show up to care. So, and I'm sure there are probably, there's out-migration of people potentially.
Other question? Yes.
There's a question for Jessica. First of all, congratulations on the success of this enormous international collaboration. So we're talking in the context of success and moving forward. From that point of view, in terms of lessons learned, were there any particular challenges or that that particularly caught your attention that it might be useful to the audience to hear about? That you have a lot to choose from.
Maybe one or two challenges, because I think there's a long list probably.
Any particular surprises?
Well, I will say that I can certainly speak for myself that I was very surprised that the first 90 was the biggest challenge. I had been sure that the second 90, which would reflect linkage to care, and the third 90, which would reflect, retention in care and adherence to antiretrovirals and access to effective treatment. I thought those two were going to be the ones that were really going to be low. And when the data first started coming in that showed us what viral load was like, I kept saying, this can't be real. I just don't believe it. Are you sure? And then we began to see it in country after country after country. So that was, I'd say, I guess, a pleasant surprise, really. And, it just helps us focus on that first 90. Because once people know their diagnosis, a very large proportion of them are actually linking to care, having access to effective antiretroviral treatment, and they are taking their medications. So again, I'm going to echo, Wafaa, your theme that a lot of progress has been made. Yes, there are gaps to address, but really a lot of progress has been made.
And it's interesting to contrast the local and global, because I think when you look at the global platform, it is the first 90 where the gap is, and then people are doing very well once they know. And it contrasts with the US, where, you know, a very high proportion of people know their status, but we lag behind in initiation of ERT and viral suppression, with the exception of New York City. But it's kind of, I think that's a contrasting global versus local. Bisrat?
Yeah, I was going to say, I didn't show our 90 data.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
We have to reframe the way we show our continuums. But we actually have not achieved it. So we achieved the first 90, not the second, as you were saying. So I think Washington achieved their 90-90, but you know, many jurisdictions in the U.S. have not achieved it, surprisingly, because of the issues of adherence. And all
It's
the
an
other
interesting
social
contrast. Jessica?
So, on this topic, often people, when we're talking about it, people will ask me, well, why? Why is it better in so many of these sub-Saharan countries than it is in the U.S.? And my initial response is always to say, the surveys don't tell us why. The surveys are descriptive studies, so they tell us what it is. And really, I'd almost say it's a question to go to the audience to say, well, why do you think that it's not as strong in the U.S. in many settings as it is in these resource-limited settings that we are seeing in sub-Saharan Africa? I mean, people may have opinions. We don't have the answers for that, at least not from the surveys.
Maybe Isaac, there are impediments in the U.S. to people accessing services, and maybe you can talk about that.
I don't have any real evidence of this, but I travel a lot just for fun, and I realized something as I travel that in the United States, people are, I don't know, I think when you're abroad, especially in maybe poorer countries, because HIV is more of a problem, I think they just know more about it, and they're just sort of taking better steps at preventing it, whereas there's parts of the United States where it's not really thought of as a real issue. I don't know. I think that's just my opinion of how it works. Whenever I travel, I'm gay, so I'm on Grindr sometimes, and so I noticed that abroad everyone does use condoms. For some reason in the United States, it's more of there's a thing that condoms aren't really used. I don't know if that's because a lot of people aren't prepped or don't care, but it's just something about it.
Interesting, yeah. Take a question? Yes, go ahead, Tiffany.
Jessica, you made the question that I think is very provocative right now about do we do targeted testing and really increase that yield versus we really want everyone to know their status, and do that we probably need to introduce stigmas. We normalize testing, offer it maybe in every counter we can. And I know internationally the funding's really been geared towards targeted testing, increasing the yield, but I'd be curious what all three panelists thought about what direction should we be going in?
Bisrat, you want to start? Yeah.
I mean, the approach we've taken in New York City is to treat those two strategies as complementary to one another. So rather than one or the other, use both. We have resources here, we have political will, that's been a huge force for our ending of the epidemic work. And there's still, another discussion point, a lot of HIV exceptionalism here in New York City and other places. But we're fortunate as a result to have a lot of funding, so we can implement these policies. We can fund hospitals, clinics to do routinized and also targeted testing, so particularly for the CEOs. So we're doing both, but I think there are pros and cons to each approach.
But if you couldn't do both?
Then it gets into issues of cost effectiveness, I think. And I think the data are mixed on this. But yeah, targeted, you get a higher positivity rate. I imagine in lower resourced settings, that's going to be a really important strategy probably first.
And Jessica, what are your thoughts on
I mean, I think that, yes, with targeted testing, you get a higher rate, what's often called a higher yield. But I have concerns that when targeting is so focused that it starts to stigmatize those individuals who are getting tested because they're potentially going to be labeled as those who are at highest risk, and it could almost backfire in a way. If you make HIV testing a completely normal, routine activity as part of regular health care, that you should, particularly in higher prevalence settings, let's say get an HIV test every year, I think that would be very beneficial from that point of view of stigma. But you'd probably be looking at yields of 1%. And that would mean, if you think about the 5.5 million people who need to be identified, you'd have to do 500 or 600 million tests to find those. And as I showed you the data, right now, at least the two biggest funders, so PEPFAR and Global Fund, are purchasing 174 million tests, so we'd have to really increase the number of tests purchased. I don't see the easy path at all. It's really a dilemma.
I mean, I have to say, like 174 million, this doesn't seem high to me. I mean, this is a world that has 10 billion people. So I'm just wondering, like, I think it ends up being the cost and cost effectiveness. And I'm wondering also about the issue of people are retesting, maybe just the worried well, we call them, that might be also playing a role. I kind of, what I've heard also is people are a little bit concerned about the term targeted, because it sounds like you really are kind of targeting in a negative way. And I think ultimately what we want is to offer tailored services so that they're tailored to the population you want to reach, and it's tailored and routinized for a specific population. Maybe that's maybe a better way of thinking about it, but because clearly there are subsets of the population that have not availed themselves for a lot of different reasons of testing.
Yeah, and I was going to add,
Yes.
There are groups that are just not great about, or people aren't great about assessing their own risk, and even their providers. So for, again, women of color, just because I've thought about that population a lot as we've launched our marketing campaign, they're not great about assessing their own risk, and the traditional risk factors may not necessarily apply, such as number of sexual partners. It may be more about the burden of HIV within their sexual network that's playing a bigger role. So the idea of organization of testing, is actually, important.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question on targeting.
Bisrat.
Yeah. So we talked about how we are, and we said using that word carefully. There's two populations that I have worked with over the years, sex workers and trans population. I think that DOHMH and CDC is one that are quite bad at that. For historically, trans people were grouped under MSM. So now we're separating that, or we're grouping that under cisgender women. And I do get where people are coming from in collecting that data, but at the same time, I think that we have to look at the very different needs of those two populations. And then also sex workers. I have personally, when I was exposed myself in different positions that I held, there's community-based organizations out there giving out free condoms. There's an out there giving out swimmers, safe when they're taking drugs. So I wonder, are these target outreach filters at clinics, and is that good enough? And we're dealing with those two populations specifically, which seem to be quite transparent here.
Yeah, Bisrat, do you want to start?
Thank you. That's great feedback. In terms of the data, I think we've struggled in terms of how to represent transgender experience. We've listed them separately at times. More recently, we've started listing them not under cisgender, but just under women. So if you saw one of my pie charts, it was women, and we had transgender women as a part of that pie chart, so combined. But yeah, it's a challenge because you're right, that population has, specific needs that may differ from cisgender women. In our current social marketing campaign, we actually made it a combined, campaign to address both needs. And that was based on community consultation. We actually held a lot of meetings with both cisgender, transgender women, very heavily women of color, and that was the consensus that transgender women wanted to be considered women, not necessarily, separated out and marketed to, separately. So that was based on feedback. In terms of services, I think we try to support CBOs in particular to provide services, and there's actually right now a set of contracts working with transgender-led organizations. There are 4 that we've been working with to fund them to actually develop as an organization such that they'll be able to in the future provide more services. So I imagine in the future this will get better, but I think more resources need to be allocated.
And maybe a question to you, Isaac, is I think another challenge that I know the city has tried to tackle is how do you reach young gay men, especially young gay men of color, and what are your thoughts in terms of ideas, innovations on how to get to people who HIV may not be their highest priority?
Well, we spoke about the campaigns we do like Jack and Ryan, but I do believe those are effective because I always see them pop up, and I think those are good. I'm still thinking about my friend. I'm trying to figure out what happened.
What went wrong?
Like I said, we're all pretty knowledgeable about PrEP and condom use, and I'm not sure. I think it's just pushing that message out, getting tested and just knowing your status
and trying to get people to a comfort zone. I think we've run out of time. Before we end, I'm gonna take just a brief survey of everybody in this room. Remember that question, ever tested? Raise your hand if you feel comfortable to indicate that you've ever been tested. This is wonderful. This is great. This is great. So this is a group that's aware. I think this is a group that's aware of the power of knowledge. That's very important. And before we end, I want to always remind everyone that we all have a responsibility on World AIDS Day and the rest of the year is to talk to everybody we know in our social networks, our friends, colleagues, and the example that Isaac mentioned is very profound, is you never know that one thing that you say or that one referral that you make or that's one outreach, that is powerful. And I think if all of us think of ways in which we can continue to disseminate information about the epidemic that is still here around us in New York, in the US, and around the world, and to think very carefully about what we individually can do to really hopefully try to get to the end of the HIV epidemic. So I want to end by thanking, first of all, our great speakers and panelists. Thank you very much. Talk to them, because we didn't have a chance to also think about all the new knowledge that needs to be generated, the research and the need to continue to push the agenda to find more tools to put them in the toolbox as we move ahead. But I want to thank all of you for being here today and thank everybody who helped make this happen. Thank you.